Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a deep, reflective look at a powerful piece of social and spiritual philosophy. We are examining Swami Vivekananda's uncompromising text from his seminal work, India and Her Problems, on social justice and spiritual equality, focusing specifically on Chapter 5, Uplift of the Masses. Now, this isn't just some dry, dusty historical text. It's actually a profound and sometimes confrontational analysis of society, power, and human dignity that flips how we view privilege. So, let's get started. Swamiji breaks his philosophy down into 5 distinct acts, which we will follow today. Act 1, their worth. Act 2, the present condition and its cause. Act 3, why religion is not at fault. Act 4, the remedy of education. And finally, Act 5, our responsibility.
Let's dive into Act 1, where Swamiji establishes the immense worth of the working class, calling them the true backbone of the nation. Swami Vivekananda argues that the silent, uncomplaining work of the masses is the literal foundation of human civilization. Reflect on this for a second. Throughout human history, the supremacy and eminence of the world's mighty empires like Babylon, Rome, Spain, and England was built upon the unrewarded continuous labor of the working class. The world-conquering heroes of war and great spiritual figures get all the praise, but the foundation was laid by the peasants, weavers, and laborers, the very people whom society looks right past. They, from time immemorial, have worked silently to produce the wealth of the land, and yet tragically often do so without ever getting fair share of pay and recognition for their efforts. To prove just how dependent society is on its workers, Swamiji gives a very concrete example from his time, the city sweepers. He points out that if the street sweepers of Calcutta stopped working for just one day, it created an immediate panic. If they went on strike for 3 days, the entire town faced being overridden by waste and deadly diseases. The elite depended completely on the working class for their basic survival, yet they still looked down on them and boasted about their own superior culture. Fast forward to today, surely you can think of modern examples where the exact same rule applies. Before turning to their poverty, Swami Vivekananda pauses on something easy to overlook: the character of the people themselves. He's direct about what they lack, ignorant about secular things, in his own words. But he's just as direct about what they possess. He recalls being nearly mobbed in America and England for nothing more than the clothes he wore. In India, he says he never once heard of a stranger treated that way over something so trivial. Swamiji states it plainly. They are not dunce, not slow, only thirsty for information as any race under the sun. Formal schooling, he's suggesting, was never the same thing as civilization. This brings us to a powerful realization. Swamiji asks us to completely rethink our definition of glory. He points out that even a coward can look brave when there is a multitude to cheer them on. That kind of courage is cheap. True heroism, he states, isn't found on a battlefield where a crowd is cheering you on. Instead, it lives in the boundless patience and devotion of the ordinary worker, performing small, unnoticed acts every single day, often facing scorn rather than applause for it. And it is you who are actually doing this, ye ever trampled laboring classes of India. I bow to you, he says. Think about it. Swamiji, the most revered monk from India in our modern times, bowing not to kings but to the trampled laboring classes of India.
Now let's move to Act 2, present condition and its cause. If these foundational classes are so vital, how did they become subjected to such cruelty and poverty? If these foundational classes are so vital to civilization, how did they end up being treated as less than equals? Swamiji points out a tragic irony in how societal power actually works. Whether leadership rests on learning, wealth, or military force, its true power is always drawn from the masses, by fair means or foul, as he puts it, through deceit, force, or even willing gift. Yet inevitably, through what he calls the strange irony of fate, the ruling classes isolate themselves from the very people who generate their power and simply stop taking the working class into account. By cutting themselves off from their own source, the elites guarantee their own eventual downfall. When addressing the terrible condition of the poor, Swamiji refuses to point fingers at external forces or foreign rulers. Instead, he blames internal society, the aristocratic classes directly. He argues that elite ancestors trod the common masses underfoot until the poor were hypnotized into believing they were helpless. He highlights a heartbreaking reality. India is a place where human beings are forced to sleep alongside cattle and have nearly forgotten they are even human. He demands accountability, saying, "We are to blame. Stand up, be bold, and take the blame on your own shoulders."
Act 3, Religion Not at Fault, where Swami Vivekananda defends spiritual truths from those who blame faith for social oppression. To understand how Swami Vivekananda defends his faith against critics who wanted to blame and even crush Hindu religion itself for the masses' suffering, we first need to look at a core concept of Advait Vedanta. Advait is the spiritual teaching of absolute non-duality. The idea that at the deepest level, there is no real separation between beings at all. As Swamiji puts it, every being is only your own self multiplied. If that's true, then oppressing another person is, in a very real sense, oppressing yourself. Because of this, the core tenet of the religion doesn't preach hierarchy or oppression at all. Instead, it teaches the absolute highest dignity of humanity, universal equality, and a boundless sympathy between all people. But there is a profound disconnect between that beautiful philosophy and grim reality. Swamiji points out the blazing hypocrisy of preaching Advaita, this grand spiritual unity, while actively practicing heartlessness and untouchability. He explains that when society forgot how to actually live this philosophy, the Lord came as Buddha to teach people how to sympathize with the poor, the miserable, and the outcast. Buddha's entire mission was to bring that practical sympathy to life. Yet the ruling classes refused to listen. Swamiji draws a pointed parallel here. Just as the Jews, in his account, turned away from Jesus and were left to wander the world as homeless beggars ruled over by others, so too did India become enslaved by foreign nations after its own leaders turned tyrant over their own people. And in a line that captures the whole tragedy in a single stroke, Swamiji insists tyrant and slave are ultimately synonymous. A nation that oppresses its own will sooner or later find itself oppressed in turn. Swamiji calls out the absurd hypocrisy of preaching spiritual unity while practicing untouchability. He states the paradox in the starkest possible terms. No religion on earth preaches human dignity as loftily as Hinduism, he says. And yet, no religion on earth treads upon the necks of the poor and the low as harshly as Hinduism does either. Labeling the elites as hypocritical gatekeepers, he points to how they invent engines of tyranny to keep the lower classes degraded. The educated leaders of the time are accused of extracting money from the poor for their own schooling while refusing to even touch those same people in return. Preaching the greatest religion the world has ever seen while feeding the masses stuff and nonsense was, in his words, simply adding insult to injury. As Swamiji so vividly puts it, you have a perennial fountain of wisdom flowing, yet you give the masses ditch water.
This takes us to Act 4, the remedy. Education, waking the inherent Brahman. Having diagnosed this deeply rooted societal illness, Swami Vivekananda identifies the singular catalyst capable of reversing this generational hypnosis. And to prove his point, he shares a really fascinating anecdote. He recounts observing an Irish colonist named Pat arriving in New York. Now first, Pat comes from a homeland where nature itself seemed to whisper to him. In Swamiji's words, "Pat, you have no more hope. You are born a slave and will remain so." And hearing this his whole life, Pat came to believe it. Second, he arrives in America destitute, haggard, and full of fear. But third, within just 6 months, he's transformed by a society shouting the exact opposite at him. "Pat, you are a man as we are. Have courage." And fourth, as a direct result, Pat walks upright, his fear vanishes. Swamiji ties this straight back to Vedanta. The same Brahman within that had shrunk away under years of contempt simply woke up the moment someone told him the truth, echoing the ancient call of the Katha Upanishad itself: arise, awake, and stop not till the goal is reached. Conversely, Swamiji identifies the chief cause of a nation's ruin: the monopolizing of education and intelligence among a privileged few through pride and royal authority. He draws a broader historical line here too. The moment education began spreading downward from the aristocracy to ordinary people is, in his view, exactly what separates modern Western civilization from older civilizations like India, Egypt, and Rome, which kept knowledge locked within a ruling class. History shows that a nation advances only in exact proportion to how knowledge spreads among its ordinary masses. Hoarding knowledge and locking it away for the elite is a profoundly destructive force that keeps the masses hypnotized and powerless. And Swamiji insists if India is to rise again, it will have to happen the same way it did elsewhere, by spreading education among the people. So, what is the proposed solution? Well, it's simple but radical. Swamiji states, my idea is to bring to the door of the meanest, the poorest, the noble ideas that the human race has developed both in and out of India, and let them think for themselves. Here he's laying out his core remedy for uplifting the masses. Instead of making the poor come to knowledge through distant schools, fees, or caste barriers, knowledge should be carried directly to them, to their very doorstep, however low their social or economic standing. And what's delivered shouldn't be narrow or filtered. It should be the full breadth of human achievement, drawn from both Indian and world thought alike, with nothing held back as unsuitable for them. Crucially, the goal isn't to dictate belief or behavior. It's to hand people the raw material of ideas and trust them to reason and decide for themselves, rejecting any top-down paternalistic version of reform in favor of genuine intellectual independence. Swamiji's solution distills into three moves: universal access, universal content, and individual autonomy, directly answering the monopolized education problem raised earlier. The fix isn't a new elite deciding what the poor should learn, but removing the gatekeeping altogether.
And that brings us to the final act, Act 5, our responsibility, the call to grassroots action. This is not passive philosophy meant for intellectual debate in comfortable parlors. It is an impassioned, uncompromising demand that the privileged class should dedicate their lives to restorative justice. Swami Vivekananda declares all those as traitors who, having been educated at the expense of the millions who live in hunger and ignorance, pay not the least heed to them. He holds this educated class directly accountable for the state of society, putting a staggering number on it. 200 million people, by his own count, the vast majority of India's population at the time in the late 1800s, left to live as no better than hungry savages. Swamiji puts it bluntly: those who strut about in their finery, flaunting wealth built on grinding down the poor, are wretches unless they actively use their privilege to help lift them out of poverty. To fix this, Swamiji lays out a highly practical grassroots strategy. First, establish a central college to train dedicated missionaries, disinterested sannyasins as he calls them, monks motivated purely by service rather than personal gain. Second, have them travel physically from village to village. Third, teach practical secular skills like trade and agriculture using the modern tools of the time like maps, globes and cameras to make learning accessible. And fourth, share the empowering spiritual truths of the scriptures with all people, right down to the chandalas, the very lowest and most excluded castes, finally breaking the monopoly the Brahmins had long held over religious teaching. As Swamiji famously put it, if the mountain does not come to Muhammad, Muhammad must go to the mountain. In other words, if the poor are too destitute to come to the schools must go directly to them. To achieve this cultural awakening, Swami Vivekananda is crystal clear. True reform depends entirely on the condition of the masses in their cottages, not on the superficial social debates or surface-level reforms of the elite. The fate of a nation doesn't rest on the habits of the privileged few, but on lifting the millions living in hunger. To make this happen, Swamiji calls for a unique synthesis of global values. He challenges young people to adopt the Western spirit, their drive for equality, freedom, hard work, and organizational energy. But at the same time, he insists on remaining deeply rooted in India's own spiritual culture and empathy. It's not about abandoning your heritage to modernize, it's about combining the best of both worlds. Swami Vivekananda's words were written generations ago, but if we look closely at our world today, the core dynamics remain unchanged. We still live in a society where the comfort, technology, and privilege enjoyed by a few are built entirely on the unseen, underpaid labor of millions, from drivers delivering our food to factory laborers producing our technology. The hypnosis Swamiji spoke of still exists, often disguised as systemic inequality or a lack of access to quality education, tools, and networks. If we take his philosophy seriously, it demands that we look at our own education and privilege and ask what we are doing to actively lift others. As we conclude this study guide, here are two questions to reflect on and carry forward in your life. First, in your daily life, who are the unseen workers keeping your world running? And how can you use your education, skills, and platform to ensure they receive fair recognition, dignity, and a voice? Second, how can you help build a future that embraces the modern world's drive for equality, technology, and progress while remaining deeply anchored in empathy and your spiritual roots? The choice to act, as always, belongs to you. Thank you for taking the time to explore this profound philosophy. Keep learning.